Thank you for being here.
Very smart.
My parents gave me a great family foundation. I didn't grow up in money.
His company quickly skyrocketed in value, landing on Forbes' coveted 30 under 30 list.
We need to believe in something bigger than ourselves.
Biotech billionaire Vivek Ramaswamy would announce his bid for the governor of his home state, Ohio, early next week.
I'm proud to say that I achieved the impossible, which is that most of you actually know how to say my name by now.
Wow, it's a big crowd.
Looks good, too.
Okay, we get a half hour, actually a little less, so I'm going to get going. Vivek, why don't we start with, everyone knows who you are, so we don't have to talk about that, but I don't know how many people know your background. The important thing is you're probably viewed by lots of people as a politician because of what you've been through, but you're really a businessman who decided to try to do something about a myriad of issues, some of which we'll touch upon. Could you spend just a few minutes and give this room a little feel for how you got to?
Sure. I mean, I definitely have a firm view that more people who have a successful track record in business should pursue public service for limited periods of time and then go back to being capitalists or whatever it is one wants to do. But I'll tell you what my own journey was. I started my career probably in the seat of many of you in the audience as an investor. I worked at a hedge fund investing in biotech companies for 7 years, from 2007 to 2014. I had studied molecular biology, thought I was going to be a scientist, ended up drawn into the world of biotech investing. Spotted some opportunities at that time that I thought companies weren't pursuing, where big pharma companies were all running like lemmings in the same direction at the same time, but left behind certain therapeutic areas. And I ended up building a company that in-licensed a lot of those drugs that were partway through the development process, but in disfavored areas from pharma. And through a long story short, I led that company as CEO for 7 years. 5 of the medicines we worked on are FDA-approved products today. It's a $8 to $10 billion company trading on the NASDAQ at present. I stepped down from my job as a biotech CEO in 2020 when I had my first son, changed my worldview, really changed my view in terms of where I wanted to spend the next chapter of my career. But there was also something interesting that happened in May of 2020, which is the month that George Floyd tragically died, and there were protests. Let's be honest, some of them were violent protests across the country. And there was a lot of pressure on me at the time to make a public statement, as basically every other tech and biotech CEO was doing at the time, taking a corporate stand on that question of whether or not this was an injustice and whether or not companies should play a role in wading into some of these social issues. And at that time I said the role of a company is to stick to its mission, in my case, developing medicines, which stoked enough controversy that led me on a 6-month journey where I basically had to make a choice between either staying at my company, staying as CEO and keeping my mouth shut, or starting a new chapter of being able to speak my mind freely and in the open. And so I stepped down from my job as a biotech CEO, wrote my first book. I've written 4 books. That was the first of them at the time, making the case that companies should stay out of politics and focus on their mission. And that was itself the beginning of a journey for me where, if I have one recommendation, if you know what you believe, try writing it down, and then that will test whether or not you actually know what you think. That's what my experience of writing my first book was like. And ever since then, I've founded a number of other companies that I can share with you, in financial services, to a Medicare company, to more recently companies in other spaces. But my first career was an entrepreneur, but that's what led me to the doorstep of eventually running for office and addressing some of the obstacles that I encountered as an entrepreneur when it came to the overgrowth of government in the regulatory state.
Okay, so at the lunch break, there was a group of people that met with Vivek, and he talked about some of these things. And one of the things that we chatted, and we found we actually have a few things in common, including we're both the product of public school education, parochial school education with Jesuits, and private school education. And you've said many times, I agree, I think most people in the room will agree with this, that this is the greatest country on earth and the greatest political experiment. but our education results, especially our public education system today, doesn't reflect the greatest country by almost any measure. And that's what is the future, is those kids we're educating. It's craziness, and I know you have some views on it, and I'd love for you to talk about that.
I do. It actually relates to my journey to criticizing a lot of woke culture and victimhood culture 4 years ago when I stepped down from my job as a CEO, relates to exactly my views on the future of American education. It's very personal to me. My parents came to this country with no money over 40 years ago. I founded successful companies. My wife lived a very similar American dream story. Her parents came to this country penniless. She's a successful throat surgeon at Ohio State today. And when we look at our kids, I'm genuinely worried they're not going to be able to live the same American dream that we lived, in part because our educational system is failing our kids. A staggering stat is the fact that 75% of kids in 8th grade are currently unable to perform math at their age-adjusted function on an international basis. We're number 26 out of 38 developed countries when it comes to academic achievement and results in math, reading, writing proficiency. And just speaking as an American, I find that utterly unacceptable. And I do think that there are fixes to the educational system we can talk about that I've been focused on and will focus on in my next step in my own journey in public service. But I think there's a deeper cultural issue in our country that we have to grapple with as well. I think we have grown accustomed to rewarding victimhood in the United States of America. The thing that we have, I believe, taught our kids for at least a generation to celebrate is whether or not you're a greater victim, rather than whether or not you're actually a victor, whether you're excellent. And I think America at our best, the thing that does make us the greatest country known to the history of mankind, which I have said and I stand by, is that we are a country that celebrates the pursuit of excellence without having to apologize for it. Whether it's the best in math or the best on the sports fields or the best in music or the arts or whatever it is, this is the nation on God's green earth where you get to be the very best and maximize your own God-given potential without anybody standing in your way. To me, that's the essence of what the American experiment is about. It's about meritocracy. What is a meritocracy? A meritocracy is a system that recognizes that not everybody has the same God-given talents. In fact, I would go one step further. No two people have the same God-given talents. And that's true diversity. That's a beautiful thing. But a meritocracy is a system that allows you to achieve the maximum of your God-given potential, no matter what that may be. That is what the United States of America is an embodiment of at our best. That's what made America great the first time. And I think that reviving that spirit is how we're going to make America great again, not succumbing to the victimhood culture that has become very popular. And it's not just a left-wing or a political thing. It has a political valence, but I think it's deeper than politics. It is a deeper culture that rewards a kind of victimhood over excellence that I think we need to overcome. And then there's things that politicians and leaders need to do to help get some of the impediments out of the way. I don't think modern social media has been good for our kids. I don't think the way in which we have really allowed the proliferation of new kinds of toxins, not necessarily chemical toxins, but digital toxins, have really led to a crisis of self-confidence, a crisis of depression, anxiety, a mental health epidemic spreading like wildfire across the country that fans the flames of this new victimhood culture. So I'm not saying that any one person is to blame for this, but taking a big step back, I think we do need to light a fire under the feet of our culture to revive the celebration of hard work and achievement in our country again. And if we do, I think we will continue to live up to be that greatest nation known to the history of man. But we have work to do. I agree with you.
So there's a fair amount of talk in the press about what you're going to do next. And there's a lot of talk about you possibly, you live in Ohio, you're
Yes.
from Ohio, you live in Cincinnati, and running for governor of Ohio.
Yeah.
Do you want to, because that leads
that is
to
highly,
a lot of what you just talked about.
I tend to be pretty transparent with things. That is highly likely and what I'm moving towards, taking really serious steps towards looking at. And one of the things I learned in my experience running for U.S. president, I became the youngest person ever to run for U.S. president when I ran in February of 2023. my favorite part of the campaign was reaching the next generation of Americans. But one of the things I came to learn is that the beauty of the American system is that it's not a one-man job. Even a US president can fix a lot of the failures at the level of a federal government. But if you're really serious about leading the way and reviving our educational system, since we're talking about that, let's stick to that. That's led by the states. At its best, that's led through our system of federalism. And I think one of the things that we're missing in that next generation as well, in some ways in my generation, I'm a millennial, is we've lost that sense of national pride and identity in who we really are. And I think if we can bring that back through civic education in the States, where every kid who graduates from high school should at least, at minimum, have to pass the same civics tests that every legal immigrant has to pass before becoming a citizen of this country. Restore that sense of self-confidence, of being able to achieve something with your own hard work and your own merit and your own dedication. That's how the stuff of how we save a country. And so I think there's plenty of presidents that has got to do to lay the basics, table stakes for that, seal a border, adopt basic sensible economic policies. And I ran for president. Donald Trump's now the president. I'm confident that he's going to lead us this next year into a new golden age at the federal level. But it's not a one-man job. And I do think that if we're really going to save the country, it's a team effort required. It's going to be every one of us stepping up to save ourselves, and a big part of that starts with the states as well. I'm from Ohio. When I think about the self-confidence of parts of the country outside of the coasts, New York and California may have had the economic leadership position in our economy over the last 20 years. Well, if it was Silicon Valley for the last 20 years, I think it can be the Ohio River Valley for the next 20 years, in terms of maybe not the same way that Silicon Valley led in creating apps or new internet advances, but in production of semiconductors, production of defense industrial bases that we're missing in this country, leadership in aerospace exploration, where Ohio actually has a great heritage with John Glenn, Neil Armstrong. We could bring that back. That too is, I think, part of not only developing an economy, but reviving that sense of conviction, that sense of self-confidence that so many kids who live in a place like Ohio might miss today, but I think deserve to have, not through fake verbiage, but through actual action. And that's part of what I hope to deliver in this next chapter.
Okay, so you talk about, it really comes down to common sense. We've got national debt and Fed spending that is problematic. How do we harness that? How do we fix that? What's the solution? I think we've gotten to such a point, the numbers are so big that people can't really relate to how much money this country owes our bondholders. It's just like you can't really, how do we?
Well, I mean, you can't really process it. You say, I think the markets are processing it. I mean, the fact that 10-year rates are sending a signal to us ought to be a wake-up call that we do have a serious national debt problem that we're going to have to contend with as a country. And I'll tie this back to actually even the culture of victimhood that I was talking about before in a moment. But just on the math of it, it's about a $36 trillion national debt and growing. Pretty soon, interest payments on our national debt are going to become consistently the largest line item in our federal budget. And that eventually becomes a kind of quicksand that we're not going to be able to get out of. Solving this problem, people think is very difficult. They get into abstract solutions and philosophies of whether or not we're small government conservatives or whether we're big government spending liberals. I'd rather take a more pragmatic approach. I'll tell you a funny experience I've had even in Washington, D.C. over the last several months is you'll get a lot of congressmen or senators, and you can ask them a question about how much is the non-discretionary spending here and the mandatory spending there. They can give you one-off answers from the standard talking points. A funny experience I had is just ask most congressmen or even U.S. senators, how much money did the U.S. government spend last year? Just like not non-discretionary this, mandatory that. Forget the talking points, just cash accounting. How much did we spend last year? Answer to that question is about $7 trillion, just shy of $7 trillion. Next question. How much did we spend in this prehistoric era known as 2019? It's actually not that long ago. 2019, how much did we spend? Answer, less than $4.5 trillion. So when people talk about the daunting task of saving $2 trillion from the federal budget, if one does that, by the way, our budget is fine. We're off the scale of bankruptcy. We're fine. Back to a golden fiscal era for the country, saving $2 trillion of our federal budget every year. Sounds like a lot. All that requires is going back to 2019 levels. Not even all the way there, just most of the way there. So this is achievable, right? This is not a difficult math problem. Interest rates then come down, and what becomes quicksand instead becomes a virtuous circle to be able to say then your interest costs come down, therefore you're spending less, and you end up in a perfectly fine place fiscally as a country. So why don't we get there? It's easy to blame the politicians, and I think we should. But a big part of this also requires a long, hard look in the mirror ourselves. It comes back to that culture of dependence. And I think the way we're going to save our country isn't through greater dependence on our government, but instead actual independence from it. It's not through victimhood, it's through victory. It's not through whining, it's through winning. And so I think reviving that culture of self-reliance and determination, that's what America was founded on. Right? We are the pioneers and the explorers. Our founding fathers, they were, like many of you in the room, entrepreneurs, businessmen who believed in the importance of a country that stood for excellence and for freedom. If we have that cultural change, in many ways the politicians are just responding to the cultural demands of their electorate. But if we're able to change the cultural demands of our electorate by reviving our sense of identity and pride in who we really are, then it'll become that much easier for the politicians to cut the level of spending needed to otherwise placate the masses. And that's what I think is actually going on in the country.
Well, look, the reality is that from the political perspective, until the pendulum swings too far, and maybe it has,
Yeah.
but when you're a politician and you promise voters free stuff.
Mm-hmm. It's a good strategy in the short run.
Yeah, they want it, and so it's a pretty good way to get yourself elected, but the problem is it's not free. Nothing's actually free. It comes from somewhere. In this case, it's coming from $36 trillion and going. Yeah. So then it makes me think of how the federal government does various programs like the CHIPS Act. Mm-hmm. The Inflation Reduction Act. Mm-hmm. Well-intended, but I believe flawed in terms of its efficacy.
Sure.
Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So look, I think most government programs actually come from good intentions. I think most people who work in the government are not bad people because most human beings are not bad people. But even with the best of intentions have created, I think, a culture in our government that has hurt the very people it was intended to help. So I think you could talk about the welfare and the entitlement state. There's a new entitlement state 2.0, corporate entitlement state, that I'll talk about embedded in some of the acts that you mentioned. But even in the first version of the entitlement state, since Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in the 1960s, it has failed to serve many of the worst off Americans, including in minority communities, where you look at family formation rates, where you look at relative economic mobility. It's worse for many black Americans and other communities than it was back in the 1950s before that individual entitlement state. And instead, I think we're taking a step further in the wrong direction by now creating a new corporate entitlement state. So take something like, you brought up the CHIPS Act. My view is, does the United States need to shore up our semiconductor supply chain? Absolutely. Is it viable for the United States to continue to remain dependent on China or Taiwan for the semiconductors that power our modern way of life? It's impossible. It's not a tenable future for the U.S.
Isn't it a national security risk?
It's absolutely a national security risk. Now, does writing a check and just showering that on the populace solve that problem? No, it does not. And in fact, in some ways, it may actually have the opposite effect. The rate limiter to whether or not we're able to produce leading-edge semiconductors in the United States is not actually capital. When you look at the reduction in the cost of capital for semiconductor firms over the course of the last 3 years, that dwarfs the amount of cost of capital reduction due to money flowing from the federal government. Capital, or the cost thereof, has not been the rate limiter. It's actually talent. It's actually human capital. It's actually the fact that 25% of eighth graders, and no more than that, are proficient on an age-adjusted basis. Goes back to education. It's a talent base that's actually able to meet the demands of a modern global economy. That's where we need to be investing, not a Band-Aid solution at the end of the process. And so there's a parallel between what we were talking about earlier with even a lot of the issues relating to woke culture or victimhood culture, to say that if you have a problem in preschool, where kids who enter preschool from poor communities are just entering a worse preschool than somebody who is entering preschool in a wealthy community, By the time you get to college, you can use, Harvard or Yale can use whatever quota system they want to use based on race or sexuality. It's not going to solve that root cause problem dating back 14, 15, 16 years earlier. I'd say the same thing with respect to this new vision of industrial policy. If we have an educational system that isn't producing the very best in their respective domains in our own workforce, which we have an obligation to our children to ensure we do in this country, then no amount of just writing blank checks to companies that happen to lobby for them is going to change that reality. And we're seeing that today, where even many of the companies receiving the money or would have been receiving the company from the CHIPS Act are rate limited by actually having the talent base in the United States to be able to develop those leading edge semiconductors. And so I think we got to go to root causes. Part of our problem, and I think it's the beauty of our system, is that we do have 2 and 4 year cycles. But we're going to have to think on the timescales of history if we're really going to turn this ship around. And I think we can. And I think that's why more people should have kids, by the way. I told you my own worldview changed when my first son was born. My wife and I are raising 2 boys now. I think it's probably true for most people. When we think about even the question of our national debt, the people in this room, I'm looking around, are going to be, myself included, by and large, either well advanced in our years or dead and gone by the time that that actually cripples and crushes the U.S. economy. But you know who's not is our kids. My 2 sons and your kids and their generation, it's going to fall on their shoulders. And so how do we snap out of a culture that thinks about pursuing what we want tomorrow instead of a decade or 2 decades from now? I think once we have a greater culture of people who have skin in the game through thinking about this through the lens of their children, I think that's when we're actually going to think about the right solutions of reviving our education system, actually stopping the spending tomorrow that might get you a vote at the ballot box if you sign into legislation a piece of pork, but just contributes to a national debt that otherwise doesn't work. And I do think we live in one of those moments where it is time to think on the timescales of history rather than on the timescales of tomorrow. And I don't mean to sound pessimistic about this. I believe we can. In fact, it's what we've always done in our hour of need. I think there have been many rises and many falls to the American experiment. There were many rises and many falls of Rome. But I think we're in one of those moments where we have to look ourselves in the mirror and be honest with ourselves, and we require leaders who don't just tell you what you want to hear. And I think sometimes the truth is uncomfortable. We live in a moment where I think we require leaders who are willing to speak those uncomfortable truths, not with the goal of criticizing anybody, but with the goal of lighting a fire under our feet to really push us to once again be the best version of ourselves. And on a positive note, I'm actually right now as optimistic as I have been in a very long time for the future of the country. But we have to seize this moment of, dare I call it, national unity around this pro-excellence agenda to take that to the next level.
So, very recently, you were front and center working with Elon on the Department of Government Efficiency. I don't know if that's actually an actual department or just an idea, but it's there. DOGE.
Exists, yeah.
Okay. And I've had a lot of debates with people about what that means, and a lot of people, they tend to be maybe more liberal than I am, but you can't cut services, you can't do all these things, and I've said, efficiency means doing things better, not just being wasteful. Whether there's $2 trillion to save or whatever it is, can you talk a little about the vision for how the government can be more efficient, deliver what it should deliver to us, to the citizens, but not do it in such a wasteful way?
Sure, and it was my honor to play a role in helping get that off the ground at the federal level. And frankly, the same effort is required in each of the 50 states across the country as well.
California.
Yeah, God knows it's in California.
Oh, God.
So I'll share with you, it's not just a cost question. I think this is true at the state level, it's true at the federal level. The biggest myth in American government today, sadly it is a myth, is the idea that the people we elect to run the government are the ones who run the government. It turns out they're not, actually. The people who we elect to run the government are not the ones who actually run the government. It's generally unelected bureaucrats in 3-letter agencies, both at the federal and state level, who are writing into law rules. They don't call them laws, they call them rules, but they have the binding effect of law. And these people were never elected to those positions in the first place, so there's no backstop of accountability. That is a problem. It is a problem that has many sources. It's easy to just blame the bureaucrats, and I'm guilty of doing plenty of that myself, and a lot of that's justified. But part of the problem is many of the lawmakers who were in Congress did not want the responsibility for actually making those rules and being held accountable, so they punt that to the administrative state and the regulators, which then creates this loss of accountability, where the fundamental feedback loop of a democracy is that you may agree with the government's policies, you may disagree with the policies, but if you disagree, you get to vote the people who made those policies out. That's a democracy. If you lose that, you don't live in a democracy anymore. It might be a monarchy, it might be some kind of technocracy, but it's not a democracy. And yet, at least as recently as this past year, that was the status quo in the United States of America. And so I think it is a requirement at the federal level and at every one of the 50 states to at least make sure that we dismantle that bureaucracy in between, restore accountability, where the people who make the decisions that affect your lives ought to at least be able to be voted out rather than most important decisions coming from unelected bureaucrats. That, I think, is the first swipe at government efficiency. Like, that's the first and most basic tenet of government efficiency is actually just restoring the premise of democracy.
Do you think that is a focus of this administration?
I think it is, and I think it ought to remain. I think there's a historic opportunity, for sure. So the U.S. Supreme Court, credit to the justices that President Trump appointed in his first term, the U.S. Supreme Court has actually very recently said that a lot of those regulations are unconstitutional because Congress never passed them. I think we have a historic mandate. I mean, the American people voted resoundingly at the ballot box, not with a mandate for incremental change, but a mandate for sweeping change. Now you got Republicans who have control of the White House, both chambers of Congress, a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court. That's a beautiful thing. And the flip side is, if you succeed in delivering, that's great. You deliver for the people. But in some sense, if we fail to deliver, we have no one to blame but ourselves. And I hope that that's not the scenario that we're in. But I come back to the same message. We're victors, not victims. There was a lot to complain about over the last 4 years, and I have been among those who have complained about the Biden administration and Kamala Harris's swap out in leadership, but I think we're done with that era now, right? This isn't about complaining about the past. This is about now making use of the mandate we've been given to actually deliver a better future for Americans regardless of partisan affiliation or belief. I think that President Trump is up to that task in a big way. I mean, I think he's a rare president who gets to assume office after having already held that office, but having 4 years in between. It's a beautiful thing, actually. Grover Cleveland was the only other president who had that opportunity. And I think that in some ways, I think he is prepared to be an even better president this time around than if he had just been reelected and assumed office back in 2020. I truly believe that. And so I am optimistic about the future direction of the country, but it's not going to happen automatically. It's not going to be a one-man show coming down from the White House to save us. He's going to do his part, but I think we all have to do ours as well at the level of the 50 states and even below that at the level of our culture. And if we do, I'm confident that our best days as a country can still be ahead of us.
That's actually a good place to stop, but we're not going to, because I have one more question.
Oh, I'm good to go. We're warming up.
So, well, but the clock's telling us.
Oh, is that right?
I wanted to cover one more thing. So we started off talking about education.
Yeah.
And the reality is that our education system is not good, but our higher education system, I think, is still considered the best on earth, and we have people that come from all over the world to our schools to be educated. The problem is we as a country don't seem to have the common sense to say to those people who we've trained and given them all this, stay here now, don't go back, stay here, help us with our chips, help us with our medicine, help us with whatever it is they've learned. How do we fix that? Because it's so obvious and so crazy that we do this and
So I think, I share your view that we want the absolute best, brightest, most meritorious people coming to the United States of America to make this a better nation for the people who are here. What's an obstacle standing in the way of that? Let's understand the best arguments for the other side, which I'm actually sympathetic to, which is that the United States of America is not just an economic zone. We're not just an economic zone, we're a nation grounded in certain ideals and principles. It's not just a free-for-all economic space, a geographic landmass where we're one nation under GDP. We're one nation under God, under the ideals that set our country into motion, that give people their sense of pride and identity as Americans. I don't think that identity as Americans is the same thing as it is in Italy or in Japan, where in most countries, and this is a beautiful thing in those countries too, most countries have a genetic lineage-based identity to their national identity. I think America has a unique national identity, but it is a national identity grounded in a set of ideals that bind together an otherwise diverse and divided group of people. That's America at its best, and it's who we are, not just an economic zone. So we got to remember that. So we think about just bringing the best and brightest. It has to be the best, brightest, and those who pledge allegiance to those ideals. So I do believe that everybody, as I said, who graduates from high school, everybody who legally immigrates to this country should have to know something about this country, should be able to speak English, because we're a nation founded on a set of ideals. We have to be able to communicate with one another. But against that backdrop, we have to be a country that doesn't bend the knee to whining culture, to say that, okay, just because there's somebody in another country who does it better, we want to attract them to this country. That's who we are. That's who we are at our best as Americans. And our university system, it is the best in the world at the top. I think we would be remiss if we didn't observe that four-year college education also isn't for everybody. We have a culture where we've taught people that the only way to get a head start in the American dream is to get a four-year college degree, load up with debt, and then somehow find a job that hasn't worked out for many of those people. Many Americans are best off, and it's best for our country and best for them to be able to go into the trades, go into artisan professions, two-year education, vocational education. And we should get away from this culture that looks down or has any scorn for that, but instead celebrates that, and in many cases praises and honors those who pursue whatever their path to the American dream is. But we have to include in that also the fact that we are the nation is at the bleeding edge of scientific research, the bleeding edge of developing technology. That's who we've been, and that's who we have to remain if we're going to be the best in the world. And if we want to keep the American dream alive, I'll say this in wrapping this up is, who are we? We are still the country where our kids know that with your own hard work and your own commitment and your own dedication, you can achieve the maximum of your potential and that you're free to speak your mind at every step of the way. That is the American dream, and that is what I am on a crusade to preserve in this country, in my next step in the state of Ohio, but as best we can across the country in the next 4 years. So thank you, man, for having me.
I'm going to wrap this up by telling you guys that my wife and I almost every other week talk about, if we have to leave California, because it's nuts there, where are we going?
Come to Ohio.
I never thought I was going to Ohio, but maybe I will.